All right, welcome everyone. Good afternoon. Hope you all enjoyed lunch and aren't feeling that post-lunch slump too much yet. I'll try to keep things lively and engaging so you will stay awake and I will stay awake. My name is Courtney Cooperman. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm a housing advocacy organizer at the National Low Income Housing Coalition, or NLIHC. We're based in DC, and our mission is to achieve racially and socially equitable public policy that ensures renters with the lowest incomes have quality, accessible, affordable homes in communities of their choice. We produce research that quantifies the need for affordable homes and the impact of the housing crisis on the lowest income renters. We educate the public and policymakers about our findings, and we mobilize our nationwide network to advocate on federal affordable housing issues. Housing Oregon is one of our 68 official state and tribal partners, which is our network of statewide and tribal organizations that mobilize their constituents to advocate for policy priorities that embody our mission. I'm really grateful for the opportunity to be here and to share this information and connect with you all more deeply. So the first part of the workshop will cover the why of federal housing advocacy. What can we accomplish when we share our perspectives with our elected officials? I'll start off on a bit of an optimistic note, recapping some major wins from the past few years and the advocacy that made them possible. We'll then get into the what of federal housing policy right now, what's going on in Congress and the administration. Hint, what's going on in Congress is a bit of a dumpster fire. This will then include a brief working break where you'll have the chance to weigh in directly with your members of Congress using NLIHC's advocacy tools. If you've started looking at what's on your table, you'll have a little bit of a preview of that. We'll then move into the how of federal housing advocacy. Beyond what we'll do in this room today, what are some tips for advocating effectively, and what are the resources that we at NLIHC make available to do so? This will include an overview of our key state-specific data from our annual gap and out of reach reports, which I'll explain later in the presentation. We'll then conclude with a little interactive activity that will give you a chance to simulate the experience of data-driven advocacy and a recap of some ways to get involved with NLIHC. Before we get into the current challenges and opportunities in federal housing advocacy, it's important to reflect on the major victories of the past few years and the role of advocacy in achieving them. Recapping these victories reminds us that nothing is predetermined, that even when the political climate isn't favorable, our actions can change the weather. Let's travel back in time 3 years to the start of the COVID-19 pandemic, which is a time that we'd probably rather never travel back to or think about again. When it became clear that the public health emergency would grind life as we knew it to a halt, we knew that the lowest income people would be the most deeply affected. In our worst case scenario, we projected that renters could have collectively owed up to $100 billion in back rent, putting them at risk of eviction and homelessness in the absence of government action. This was especially important in light of the public health emergency, as research showed that jurisdictions that ended their local eviction moratoria in 2020 saw higher COVID transmission rates than they otherwise would have. Congress passed 3 major recovery bills: the CARES Act, the Consolidated Appropriations Act of 2021, and the American Rescue Plan Act, all of which contained unprecedented resources to support the lowest income renters and people experiencing homelessness. Perhaps most notably, Congress allocated $46 billion to establish a first ever federally funded emergency rental assistance program, which helped us stave off that eviction tsunami that we had been projecting. These relief measures were not guaranteed, and none of it would have been possible without decades of advocacy and coalition building that enabled us to spring into action during a time of crisis. Our ongoing efforts to educate members of Congress about housing needs, to cultivate housing champions, and to build up a nationwide network of advocates that could call their members at a moment's notice or join a sign-on letter All of that made it possible for us to act within the narrow policy window of the pandemic. Hi, we have more seats, I think up over here and in the middle here. Um, Great. So again, if we weren't constantly engaged in this work, if we just waited until an emergency period to build and to mobilize our network, we would not have gotten it done. So now I'm actually going to take a second and open it up to all of you. Were there any major housing policy victories in your communities within the past few years? And was there a significant advocacy effort to make this possible? If so, what did that effort entail? So I'll open it up to you, and there will be a prize for participation. Did anyone see an advocacy victory, something in your local community, something in the state legislature, or yes? I'll bring on the mic.
The legislature passed numerous bills this last session. And I think it was actually probably the work of everybody in here shouting and making it known that there needed to be significant investments. And so they passed several large bills. So.
Cool. Congratulations and congrats to everyone who had a role. Your prize is a copy of our gap report. Did anyone else want to share a victory, whether statewide or in their local community?
I want that report. But also, the city of Salem passed housing status as a protected class within their jurisdiction, joining the ranks of only a few counties and jurisdictions across the United States. And this has some really great implications for helping folks with housing gaps in their history related to houselessness and accessing housing in the future. So that's a huge win. And the way they were able to pass that was that they conducted a research study documenting types of discrimination that Salemites were experiencing. And from that, they were able to have the information needed to add that to their list of citywide protected classes.
That's fantastic. Congratulations. I have a few. You can grab one of these. Anyone else want to share a victory? There will be more. Oh, yes. I'm gonna squeeze through here.
The metro area passed its first ever region-wide affordable housing bond in 2020. And then the metro area also passed first for us, the supportive housing services measure, which funds homelessness, rent assistance, and supportive services.
Congratulations. Yeah, yes, you do. Yeah, it's been really great. I think from DC. Oh, yes, one more over here.
So we haven't gotten the victory yet, but we have started the grassroots section. I'm also a city councilor, and we were able to get the approval to do urban campgrounds. But we have unfortunately run into the barrier of the insurances are requiring 40,000 per tent, and which has made that completely unaffordable for the rural communities. So we are in the process of trying to get that reduced, that liability reduced for the rural communities throughout Oregon. So we will be pushing that bill again. We had a very short cycle last year. We got a late start. And so we're going to be hitting it hard and heavy this year. So if you guys start hearing about it, please get all of your agencies to start supporting it for this next coming cycle.
Thank you. And yeah, I think you'll hear throughout this session that a lot of advocacy is about persistence and doesn't usually just take one legislative session or one cycle. Usually it's an ongoing process that takes many years, and there's a lot of background work that goes into getting that victory. And I think all of these victories that you've all shared really underscore the importance of building relationships with elected officials and making them aware of local housing needs so you can easily activate those relationships and make an ask when the occasion arises. So that brings me to our current policy update and top priorities for advocacy today. And I see we have some more people. There's some seats way up here in the front. And I think one over there, one over there, one over there. Welcome. So I think I don't need to tell any of you that this advocacy for emergency measures and one-time investments, these were, of course, significant and needed, but certainly far from enough to meet the scale of the need and address the root causes of housing insecurity and homelessness. That's why we launched our Housed campaign for universal, stable, affordable homes. The Housed campaign aims to advance anti-racist policies and achieve the large-scale, sustained investments and reforms necessary to ensure that renters with the lowest incomes have an affordable place to call home. We've often found ourselves on the defensive as housing advocates, pushing back against proposed cuts to the programs we care about. And as you'll hear, we certainly still find ourselves in this environment. But the Housed campaign is our positive vision for a housing policy agenda that truly meets the needs of the lowest income people. The 4 pillars of the campaign are: 1, to bridge the gap between incomes and housing costs by expanding rental assistance to every eligible household. The second is to expand and preserve the supply of rental homes, affordable and accessible to people with the lowest incomes. The third is to provide emergency rental assistance to households in crisis by creating a national housing stabilization fund. And the fourth is to strengthen and enforce renter protections to reduce the power imbalance between renters and landlords that puts renters at risk of housing instability and homelessness. A big part of our advocacy in this current congressional session is playing the long game and building momentum for our priority legislation that falls within each of the 4 pillars. For the next few minutes, I'll discuss some of that forward-looking, proactive advocacy for our top Housed campaign priorities. Then I'll discuss our constantly evolving, up-to-the-minute advocacy to address immediate threats, namely regarding the federal budget and legislation opposed to Housing First. So that first pillar of the Housed campaign on expanding rental assistance to eligible households is so critical because currently only 1 in 4 households eligible for federal rental assistance actually receives it. And you can see here from our friends at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, a breakdown of the demographics of who's receiving that rental assistance. Our top priority bill to expand rental assistance is called the Family Stability and Opportunity Vouchers Act. And this would mark a significant expansion of vouchers that would pave the way towards universal rental assistance. This is a bipartisan bill that would create 250,000 new housing choice vouchers for families with children aged 6 and under. And it would pair these vouchers with mobility services to enable families to move to high opportunity communities. The bill is co-sponsored by Senator Chris Van Hollen of Maryland and Senator Todd Young of Indiana in the Senate, and Representatives Joe Neguse of Colorado and Brian Fitzpatrick of Pennsylvania in the House. And it's really exciting that this bill is bipartisan in both chambers because it can certainly be a challenge to get bipartisan support. And when a bill has bipartisan support, it has much higher likelihood of moving forward, regardless of who is in control of the House and Senate. Our policy priorities that fall within the second pillar include legislation that would address the capital needs backlog in public housing and invest substantially in the National Housing Trust Fund. As we'll get into a little bit later, our data shows that it's renters with the lowest incomes who face the greatest shortage of affordable homes. So we really focus on targeting limited federal resources to renters with the greatest needs. One priority bill that falls within this pillar that could move within this congressional session that would expand the supply of affordable rental homes is the bipartisan Affordable Housing Credit Improvement Act, which would make significant improvements to the low-income housing tax credit or LIHTC program. The bill would provide states with more LIHTC resources, and it would also reform the tax credit to provide additional incentives to developers to build homes affordable to extremely low-income renter households, as well as underserved rural and tribal communities. These changes would make the credit better equipped to serve renters at the greatest risk of homelessness. And we hope to see this bill included in any end-of-year tax package. Members of both parties are interested in pursuing some sort of tax package to renew expiring tax credits, and there would be a really natural place for the provisions of this bill to fit within it. So this is something that kind of could have that window to move into. The way things work in Congress is that it's pretty rare for standalone bills to just get passed. So really squeezing them into something that's a must-pass bill that everyone has a stake in is typically the strategy for getting them across the finish line. Our priority bill that falls within the third pillar is the Bipartisan Eviction Crisis Act. This bill has not yet been reintroduced in the 118th Congress, but it was co-sponsored by Senator Michael Bennet of Colorado and recently retired Senator Rob Portman of Ohio in the last congressional session. This bill would create a permanent emergency stabilization fund, incorporating lessons learned from pandemic emergency rental assistance programs. It would be funded at $3 billion annually. This fund would allow renters to access temporary assistance to stabilize them and prevent eviction when they face unexpected emergency expenses that cause them to fall behind on rent. House Financial Services Committee Ranking Member Maxine Waters also recently introduced two bills that reflect our highest ambitions on many of the House campaign pillars. The first bill, the Ending Homelessness Act, would make the Housing Choice Voucher Program a federal entitlement phased in over 8 years, meaning that anyone who meets the eligibility criteria would get a voucher. It would also ban source of income discrimination against voucher holders at the federal level, and it would invest billions into the National Housing Trust Fund, which is the first new federal housing resource in a generation. Yeah, I see a lot of enthusiasm. That's how I feel about this bill too. So the National Housing Trust Fund exclusively targeted to build, preserve, and rehabilitate housing for people with the lowest incomes that would support the development of 410,000 new rental homes. A parallel bill, the Housing Crisis Response Act, would provide $1 billion for the first new project-based rental assistance contracts since 1983, and $65 billion to repair the nation's public housing, which loses an estimated 10,000 to 15,000 units each year due to disrepair caused by chronic underfunding. Now, again, I don't want to get anyone's hopes up that these bills are going to pass in the immediate future, but a big part of advocacy is uplifting why we need them. So then when the political window opens, these can be on the table as the top priority solutions. Finally, one of our priority bills that falls within the fourth pillar of strengthening renter protections, called the Fair Housing Improvement Act, is sponsored by Senator Tim Kaine of Virginia and Representative Scott Peters of California. This bill would enact a federal ban on source of income discrimination, which allows landlords to discriminate against voucher holders and would ban discrimination on the basis of military or veteran status. Now, I know you already have a ban on source of income discrimination here. You're among the, I forget the number of states, but there's 57% of voucher holders live in places where there is a ban on source of income discrimination. But with a federal ban, there would be far more resources going into that enforcement, and I think far more awareness of the norm that this is an illegal form of discrimination. So it would have an impact even in places where there's already a ban on the books. So as I mentioned before, our strategy in this Congress is a combination of proactive advocacy for these really exciting, ambitious priorities, even if they face an uphill battle to passage, and playing defense to prevent cuts to the programs we care about and to prevent harmful proposals from gaining traction. Right now, the House and the Senate are, I guess, sort of attempting to move forward on the annual appropriations process, which sets the federal budget. 2023 started off with an alarming threat to funding for HUD programs, as congressional Republicans were demanding steep spending cuts in exchange for raising the federal debt ceiling. Those demands resulted in the passage of the Fiscal Responsibility Act, which caps top-line fiscal year 2024 spending at fiscal year 2023 levels. Flat funding acts as a cut for housing programs, since the rising cost of rent means that housing programs require a funding increase just to maintain the number of people served. The budget caps in the Fiscal Responsibility Act, while preventing Congress from spending at the scale needed, were far from the worst case scenario that some congressional Republicans were floating at the beginning of this year. And I think that this bill, this Compromise Fiscal Responsibility Act, demonstrated the potential of advocacy to achieve harm reduction. House Republicans were floating unprecedented spending cuts that would have caused tens of thousands of people to lose rental assistance. Because of persistent advocacy, we were able to prevent Congress from imposing the most stringent caps that had been under discussion. However, now House Republicans are drafting their own spending bills at levels lower than the compromises agreed upon in the Fiscal Responsibility Act, and the Senate is drafting its spending bills at the levels agreed upon in the Fiscal Responsibility Act. This creates a huge gap in proposed spending numbers between the two chambers, and the two sides need to come to an agreement in order to pass the budget for fiscal year 2024. As you have likely seen in the news, their deadline to pass that new budget is technically this Friday, September 30th, when the fiscal year ends. But the two sides are still very, very far apart, and they will need a lot more time to reach an agreement. To give themselves an extension on the budget, Congress can pass what's known as a continuing resolution, or a CR, which extends government funding at current levels. If Congress cannot come to an agreement on a CR this weekend, we will face a government shutdown. And at this point, everyone is saying that it's pretty much a guarantee that that is going to happen, although the duration of that shutdown remains unclear. And the impact of a shutdown on subsidized housing programs will really depend on how long it lasts. We'll have some toolkits and talking points coming out about the impact of a shutdown on the lowest income renters. So if you are tuned in on our email list and all that, we'll have a lot of resources going out on how to talk about that. And again, the reason why we're heading towards this shutdown is because far-right Republicans in the House are insisting on adding provisions to a CR that would have no chance of passage in the Senate. They're proposing really steep budget cuts, highly partisan border security provisions, and meanwhile, they're excluding the disaster relief aid and funding for Ukraine that a bipartisan majority of the Senate considers essential. The latest update that I have, and again, this is kind of changing by the hour, but the latest that I know is that the Senate is likely to pass a continuing resolution that keeps the government open through November 17th and includes some funding for Ukraine and disaster relief. However, that proposal will be dead on arrival in the House, even though it could pass with bipartisan support if it were put on the floor. But House Speaker Kevin McCarthy doesn't want to put it on the floor because that would incite basically a rebellion against his leadership from members of the Freedom Caucus who have gotten enough concessions to elect him as leader that they would have the power to oust him as Speaker of the House. So basically what happens now is a little bit unclear. The House is moving forward to pass a few of its own appropriations bills. They'll likely get that bipartisan CR from the Senate, and it really remains unclear how this will all get resolved. I wish I had a clearer update than that. But what I can tell you is that how you can engage in a productive way as housing advocates in this moment, regardless of how the drama in DC unfolds over the next few days. Advocates should reach out to express support for a fiscal year 2024 budget that contains the maximum possible resources for housing and homelessness programs and adequately funds programs that serve the lowest income people. I have a list of what NLIHC is prioritizing in our appropriations advocacy, in addition to the general message of maximum possible resources for housing programs. The first is the Senate's proposed funding for tenant-based and project-based rental assistance. The Senate's bill would provide funding to renew all existing voucher contracts and expand vouchers to an additional 4,000 households. By contrast, our estimates suggest that the House bill would not be sufficient to renew all voucher contracts. We also support full funding for public housing operations and repairs although admittedly, neither the House or Senate bill contains even a fraction of the resources that would be needed to meet that approximately $70 billion capital needs backlog for public housing. We support the Senate's proposed funding for homeless assistance grants, the Senate's proposed $20 million for a new program for legal assistance to prevent evictions, which the House bill would eliminate, and the House's proposed funding for the Native American Housing Block Grant Program, which proposes a 40% increase from current spending levels. Also, on the defensive side, besides appropriations, one of our top priorities is to push back against a harmful proposal called the Housing Plus Act, which was introduced by Representative Andy Barr of Kentucky. The Housing Plus Act would undermine HUD's ability to fund Housing First programs, which is, of course, an evidence-based approach that treats housing as the foundation to stability and recovery. HUD has prioritized Housing First since 2013, and when it's adequately and appropriately funded and staffed and implemented, Housing First has been proven time and time again to be the most effective approach to ending homelessness. The Housing Plus Act would undermine HUD's ability to focus on this proven solution by creating a rigid, arbitrary requirement to set aside 30% of federal homeless assistance funds for programs that are far less effective and far more costly than Housing First. This bill could force local governments, through their continuums of care, to defund existing Housing First programs, despite having demonstrated successful outcomes. We're concerned that this bill has 27 co-sponsors. They're all House Republicans. Again, this bill doesn't have any chance of passing in a Democratic Senate. It shows that opposition to Housing First, which has historically been bipartisan, is gaining traction at every level of government. So we call on advocates to share success stories from programs that integrate housing and voluntary supportive services, and to counter the false narrative that Housing First is a failed approach. So I'll pause, see if anyone has any questions before we move on to the next little piece here. Any questions so far? If not, we can move into our Legislative Action Center. So you have an overview of the outlook from Capitol Hill and some of our top priorities. We're now going to take a quick working break where you'll actually have the opportunity to weigh in. We have an online Legislative Action Center with fillable templates to send messages to your members of Congress on our priority bills, and a little sidebar where you can sign your organization onto letters in support of some of our top bills. We then do the rest. We circulate those to members of Congress when it's a key political moment. This includes an organizational sign-on letter that you can join to express support for housing resources in the federal budget, which we've sent to the Hill already, and I know that we'll be re-upping it in certainly within the next few weeks. The goal of this online Legislative Action Center is to make it really quick and easy to plug into federal advocacy, even if this isn't your expertise or if you don't have a ton of staff capacity to devote to it. I know you all have a million things going on at the state and local and neighborhood level, and you probably don't have someone analyzing the federal budget, but that's what we do. We do all of that analysis, and we turn that into the tools that you can use to weigh in really quickly. And if you want to kind of up your support for federal legislation, just linking to this Legislative Action Center in your emails or on social media is a great way to engage your network and really maximize that impact in an efficient way. So right now we're going to take a little 5-minute break. You can visit nlihc.org/take-action, or just scan the QR code that's on the top of the little packet. If you need any more of them, I have some more up here. And then basically you can, if you feel so inclined, send a message to your members in support of one of the priorities listed there, sign a sign-on letter. And this is also a prize opportunity. So I have a handful of gap reports. If you fill out a form or take a look at a letter, come up to me and I will give you a report. We'll come back in 5 minutes.
day off with the Saks Off Fit Classic, where fashion takes off.
All right, thank you so much, everyone, for taking action, for taking this time. We're gonna come back and move into the next piece of the presentation. And if you did take action, come up to me at the very end to grab your gap report. Really appreciate it. So now we're gonna move into some other opportunities for advocacy. Besides sending message to members of Congress, that's just one way to engage. Oh, I had a QR code up there too, but we're past that now. Basically moving into a menu of opportunities for advocacy activities and some tips for doing them effectively. So besides sending a message to members of Congress, as many of you all just did, there's also the traditional meeting with elected officials or their staff. And we often call these Hill visits because they can take place on Capitol Hill. For a federal elected official, you might want to meet with them at their in-district office here in the state during a congressional recess, or meet in their DC office if you have the opportunity. Many offices will also take virtual or hybrid meetings, which is a really great way to bring in people who might not be able to make the trip out to DC. And always remember that one of these Hill visits is just a conversation. In many cases, the person you're meeting with will actually have less information about the issue than you do. A lot of the staffers are really just getting started in their careers and working to wrap their heads around a huge portfolio of issues, so they'll appreciate the expertise that you bring. In terms of the nuts and bolts, we always recommend reaching out to schedule a meeting at least 2 weeks in advance. You might get a staffer rather than the member, but in some cases, that's actually preferable because they'll have more time and focus to devote to the issues that they cover. Always be sure to research the member of Congress and the staffer before your meeting so you can draw a connection to what they care about and show that you're not just looking for them to be interested in your issues. If you're meeting with a group of people, make sure you decide, a speaking order, come in with a bit of organization and structure to it. And then your agenda for the meeting should have 4 key components: an introduction, stories and data, a clear connection to the issue the member cares about, and a clear ask. When you introduce yourself, make sure you clarify that you're a constituent because members of Congress care about their constituents' perspectives. Those are the ones who vote for them. Second, provide data and share experiences that speak to the issue you're talking about. We'll get into some of that data that you can use in the following piece of the presentation. Third, make sure you connect the work that the member of Congress does to the ask that you're making. So for example, if you know that they've been a champion on issues related to better outcomes for children or for health, draw out why housing is relevant to that issue. We have a lot of resources through our multi-sector affordable housing campaign, which is called Opportunity Starts at Home, that actually does issue-specific fact sheets on how housing is connected to other issue areas. So that can be a great way to draw out those connections. Last but not least, always make a specific ask in the meeting. When you talk about an issue, connect it to a bill you want them to co-sponsor or vote for or against, or a specific piece of the federal budget. You always want to give them some homework when you leave. And of course, try to leave behind materials. This makes it harder for them to forget about you when you leave. Then you'll want to follow up sending a thank you in an email after the meeting to the staffer. You can also send digital copies of any leave behind materials and remind them of your ask. Last but not least, it's also a good practice to follow up with a post on social media. I put an example on this slide from one of our tenant board members from NLIHC. And this makes sure that your community is aware of your engagement with the elected official, and it shows that office that you represent a broader group of constituents who are all paying attention and waiting to see them follow through on the commitments that they made. Speaking of social media, there are ways that you can use social media as a standalone form of advocacy. Organizations will often do social media advocacy days, maybe include tweet storms, and there are some best practices for making these actions as effective as possible. Not all social media is created equal. A recent survey from the Congressional Management Foundation found that 78% of congressional offices say that social media has some influence on their legislators' decision-making if multiple constituents that are affiliated with an organization are posting about the issue in close time proximity to each other. So be clear, there's a few conditions there that make this effective. Someone tweeting doesn't really impact them, but a few constituents that are clearly identified as constituents, and even better if they're with an organization, that can really have an impact. It's also really essential to directly tag the member of Congress in those posts. Almost every single member of Congress has social media accounts. So then that ensures that the staffer who monitors social media will see that post. It's also helpful to use a coordinated hashtag if you are doing a social media action in collaboration with other groups. For example, we use the hashtag #CutsHurt in our campaign against budget cuts. You can see here an example from my NLIHC colleague, Lindsay, who actually got her kids involved in creating some artwork to oppose budget cuts and share that with her members of Congress in New York. And here's another sample social media post that pulls together some of these best practices. You see they tag their members, they use hashtags, they have a specific ask. Phone calls to offices can also be effective. Again, make sure that you identify yourself as a constituent, and it can be beneficial to coordinate call-in days. Traditional media advocacy can make a difference. Op-eds, letters to the editor, members of Congress really do read those, and it does establish your own credibility, your organization's credibility and leadership on an issue. It can be a great way to get a volunteer, an advocate, a tenant leader involved and have a byline establishing their authority on an issue. Another effective form of advocacy is to meet the elected official at an event where they already are. like a legislator town hall. It's good to be prepared to ask a question on your issues, to identify yourself as a constituent and with your organization's affiliation when you ask that question. And this can lead to follow-up outreach that forms the basis of a new relationship. And last but not least, sometimes the most powerful form of advocacy is when elected officials come to you rather than the other way around. You can bring an elected official to a housing development or a program and have them speak with community members. And this can go a really long way in showing, rather than telling, why investments in affordable housing and community development matter. A full 95% of congressional offices say that site visits are important. Could you raise your hand if your organization has done a site visit or something similar with elected officials before? Yeah, so I'm seeing a lot of hands. So this is a tactic many of you have done. You're familiar with this. Would you say it tends to work pretty well? Yeah, I'm seeing some nods, seeing it can be really effective. And in all of our advocacy, NLIHC emphasizes the importance of engaging and empowering people with lived experience of homelessness or housing instability. Having someone who can directly attest to the impact of a policy or program on their own life, or how lack of access to a program has created challenges in their life, can have immense sway over an elected official. And most importantly, it creates an opportunity for community members historically excluded from the political process to make their voices heard. But this sometimes runs the risk of tokenizing people with lived experience or exploiting their trauma. It's important to engage people with lived experience as authentic partners in advocacy, to engage them in co-creating the meeting agenda and shaping the policy asks, not just recruiting them at a later stage in the process to fill a slot or check off a box. At NLIHC, we always consider it essential to honor the time and the labor of people with lived experience by compensating them for their contributions. We'll always pay a stipend or a gift card to someone who speaks on a webinar or participates in our meetings. However, we are always mindful that compensation can put people's access to subsidized housing programs at risk. Additional income of above $600 from one agency must be reported to the IRS and can jeopardize that eligibility. This is something that we and our partners are always talking through, figuring out workarounds about, and of course, different states may have kind of different specifics around that too. But either way, we do consider that compensation really essential. And of course, one of the ways that people with lived expertise and people who work in direct services can make a powerful impact on housing policy is through telling their stories. As I mentioned before, data and storytelling are those two key pieces of an advocacy meeting. Elected officials do care about the numbers and the statistics, and again, we will do a deep dive into those in just a few minutes. But what really sticks are the personal stories about the impact of the affordable housing crisis and how a particular policy solution would affect their constituents' lives. People with lived experiences of housing instability can share their life experiences with their elected officials. There's really no greater expert on the real-world impact of policy decisions. People who work in affordable housing or homeless services can describe what they're seeing in the communities they serve, how their organization plays a role in addressing these challenges, and perhaps most critically, how government policies and resources enable them to do their work and how the policy they're advocating for would make a positive difference. If you're interested in learning more around this storytelling aspect, I highly recommend looking into the Housing Narrative Lab. We work with them really closely, and they have a lot of great resources. And advocacy is, of course, most effective when it is backed up by political power. Elected officials care about keeping their jobs, so they're most likely to listen to their constituents who represent populations that vote at the highest rates. One of the reasons why we face such an uphill battle to enacting housing policies that serve the lowest income renters is that renters are less likely to vote than homeowners, and low income people are even less likely to vote than high income people. To change that political calculus and build the political will for housing solutions like the ones we've talked about today, we need to empower low-income renters as a voting bloc and close the voter turnout gap. That's why NLIHC launched the nonpartisan Our Homes, Our Votes campaign. which is an initiative to boost voter turnout among low-income renters and educate candidates about housing solutions. We provide tools and resources that equip housing and homelessness organizations to register, educate, and mobilize renters to turn out the vote in their communities. Research shows that this sort of outreach is really effective. Low-income people that are engaged by nonprofits in their community were 7% likelier to vote in 2020 than comparable low-income voters not engaged by nonprofits. One aspect of the Our Homes, Our Votes campaign is the Housing Providers Council, which is a nonpartisan group of affordable housing developers, property managers, and resident services coordinators that are committed to boosting voter turnout in their properties. The council meets virtually on a regular basis to share best practices and receive trainings on nonpartisan voter engagement strategies. I included some information about that in a handout in your packet, including a link to sign up to join. So definitely check that out, or you can follow that URL on the slide for some more information. So that brings me to the next piece of the presentation, which I think is often one of the highlights, which is NLIHC's data. All of the policy priorities I outlined before are rooted in the findings of our data, which shows that affordable housing is furthest out of reach for the lowest income renters. We published 2 annual research reports that summarize the housing affordability challenges facing the lowest income renters. The Gap, which we have some copies, you've all seen me handing them out, and Out of Reach. The latest Gap report finds that the US has a shortage of 7.3 million rental homes, affordable and available to extremely low income renters, which are those making at or below 30% of area median income. There is no state or major metropolitan area where there is sufficient affordable and available housing for the lowest income households. Nationwide, there are only 33 affordable and available rental homes for every 100 extremely low-income renter households. 73% of the nation's 11 million extremely low-income renter households are severely cost-burdened, meaning they spend more than half their income on rent and utilities. In Oregon specifically, there are only 23 affordable and available homes for every 100 extremely low-income renter households. This is the second most severe shortage in the nation, following Nevada and tied with Florida. This leaves 88% of extremely low-income renters cost-burdened and 80% severely cost-burdened. Because of the history of structural racism and ongoing discrimination in the housing and labor market, Black, Latino, and Indigenous households are disproportionately likely to be renters and to be extremely low income. So they are disproportionately impacted by this shortage. 19% of Black non-Latino households, 17% of American Indian or Alaska Native households, and 14% of Latino households are extremely low income renters, compared to just 6% of white non-Latino households. This, I think, is really one of the central insights of the Gap, which is that extremely low income renters who are severely cost burdened many of them are living in housing that would otherwise be available to higher income renters who could live in this housing without being cost burdened. While 3.3 million extremely low income renters live in housing that is affordable to them, 2.6 million live in housing that would be affordable to renters making up to 50% of area median income. Another 3.5 million live in housing that would be affordable to renters making up to 80% of AMI, and another 1.3 million live in housing that would be affordable to renters above 80% of AMI. This graph really demonstrates that we can solve the shortage of affordable homes at the higher ends of the income spectrum by concentrating investments in affordable homes at the lowest ends of the income spectrum. The private market on its own is never going to meet the needs of the lowest income renters. It does take subsidy for homes to be affordable to them. With an increased supply of subsidized, deeply affordable homes, the homes that would be affordable to higher income renters, that extremely low income renters are living in and being cost burdened to live in, those homes would then become available to the higher income renters that can afford them at that price point. This is why NLIHC advocates for federal housing investments to be targeted to extremely low income renters who face that greatest shortage. This focus is something that makes us really unique in Washington, and it does sometimes put us at odds with people who are otherwise like-minded. We see people who say, there's a shortage of middle income housing in my community. We need a tax credit for that. We need subsidy for that. And I'm certainly, can sympathize with that concern of wanting people at all levels of the income spectrum to have affordable homes. But the answer isn't subsidy for market rate housing. The answer is deeper subsidy for extremely low income housing, which then frees up that higher end of the income spectrum to live in housing that they can afford. So that's something that we encounter a lot. And I think I end up showing this graph a lot of times to people who make suggestions that are kind of not the most efficient recommendation for where federal subsidy should go. We also recently published our annual Out of Reach report, which calculates the housing wage, which is the wage that a full-time worker must earn to afford a modest rental home in each community in the United States. Our calculations for this housing wage are based on HUD's fair market rent for the community, and we consider a renter to afford their home if they pay no more than 30% of their gross income on rent and utilities. So essentially, the housing wage is what a full-time worker needs to earn in order to pay no more than 30% of their income on a rental home at fair market rent. This year's Out of Reach report comes at a really unique moment for the rental market. It's one that shows that a return to normalcy does not mean stability for the lowest income households. It is certainly true that the lowest wage workers have made the greatest wage gains during an inflationary period. The Economic Policy Institute found that wages for workers in the bottom 10th percentile increased by 9% between 2019 and 2022, which was the largest percentage increase of any income group. But that 9% increase resulted in an hourly wage of $12.57, an increase of just $1.04 more per hour. As you'll see on the next slide, that doesn't even come close to the nationwide housing wage. The national housing wage for a 2-bedroom rental home is $28.58, nearly 4 times the federal minimum wage. The national housing wage for a 1-bedroom is $23.67, nearly 3 times the federal minimum wage. On average, minimum wage workers in the US must work 104 hours per week to afford a 2-bedroom apartment at fair market rent, which is the equivalent of working 2.6 full-time jobs. And there is no community in the United States where a full-time minimum wage worker earns enough to afford a 2-bedroom rental home at fair market rent. You can see that the wages differ in different states. Oh, this is the 1-bedroom. I think I skipped one. Yeah, that's the 2 bedrooms. So you can see there are different wages in different states, but there is no place where a full-time minimum wage worker can afford that 2-bedroom rental home at fair market rent. And it's really not much rosier for 1-bedrooms. A minimum wage worker has to work an average of 86 hours a week to afford a 1-bedroom rental home at fair market rent, which is the equivalent of more than 2.1 full-time jobs. And in only 7% of counties can a minimum wage worker afford a 1-bedroom while working 40 hours a week. But minimum wage workers aren't the only ones affected. Nearly 50% of all workers earn hourly wages less than the 1-bedroom housing wage, and more than 60% earn hourly wages less than the 2-bedroom housing wage. Nationwide, 13 of the 20 largest occupations pay median wages less than the 2-bedroom housing wage, and 10 occupations pay median wages lower than the national 1-bedroom housing wage. Again, echoing what I said about the GAP report, because of this history of structural racism in the housing market, people of color are more likely to be renters than white people. Meanwhile, ongoing discrimination and occupational segregation contribute to racial and gender wage gaps that place affordable housing even further out of reach for women, for people of color, and especially for women of color. The lowest wage Black worker earns 9% less, and the lowest wage Latino worker earns 8% less than the lowest wage white worker. These disparities widen at higher income levels. Because of these disparities, a white worker at the 50th percentile earns more than the nationwide one-bedroom housing wage. And a white worker at the 60th percentile earns more than the nationwide two-bedroom housing wage. Meanwhile, it is not until the 70th percentile of the wage distribution for their respective racial groups that Black or Latino workers earn more than the one-bedroom housing wage. And these disparities are even greater for Black and Latino women, whose median wages are less than that of white women and less than that of Black and Latino men. Women of color are therefore more likely to be cost burdened, which places them at greater risk of eviction. Of course, what the public and policymakers always want to know is, what is the housing wage in my community? For Oregon as a whole, the two-bedroom housing wage is $29.72, and the one-bedroom housing wage is $24.83. And you'll see you have a copy of this in the single-page handout on your tables. I have more of them if you are out of them at your table. A full-time worker earning the state minimum wage of $14.20 would need to work 84 hours a week to afford a modest two-bedroom rental, or 70 hours a week to afford a modest one-bedroom rental home. That's the equivalent of 2.1 full-time minimum wage jobs for a two-bedroom, or 1.7 for a one-bedroom. But like nationally, housing affordability isn't just an issue affecting minimum wage earners in Oregon. The wages for 21 of Oregon's 30 largest occupations fall below the two-bedroom housing wage. I know the text is really small here, but you can see this includes the wages for, well, it's 21 occupations. Some of those are janitors, teaching assistants, receptionists, and home health aides, among many others. Now, all this data can be really overwhelming. So we make it digestible and present it in a relevant way with our state housing profiles and congressional district profiles. And you'll find the state housing profile on the flip side of that out of reach data. One big reason why we do this is, perhaps unsurprisingly, so you can harness your data for advocacy. Elected officials care about how policies affect their state or district because those are the people with the power to vote them into or out of office. So when they see data, they want to see it broken down to the local level. This profile is something that you can use as an accessible summary of how housing affordability affects the state. You can use as your leave behind if you do an advocacy meeting. So you can totally steal this. We encourage, it's not even plagiarism. We make this available online for anyone to use. And you can find it at nlihc.org/housing-needs-by-state/Oregon. And then of course, it's also printed out on your tables. So before we go on to the next piece, I'm just gonna pause and see if anyone has any questions about out of reach or the gap or the state housing profiles or anything I've covered in the past few minutes. Yes. I'll come down. No, you're good.
Like a bigger picture question, but getting back to the whole concept of rent assistance and vouchers, I worked both in local government and as an eviction defense attorney during the period when pandemic related rent assistance was available. And while I was certainly happy to see households avoid eviction, it was painful to see this historic investment of dollars that was just basically a pass through to mostly for-profit landlords. And I wonder if you've heard the critique or if you have a response to the critique that like rent assistance and vouchers actually contributes to the lopsided wealth accrual that's built into our capitalist housing system.
Thank you for that. Yeah, I would say that we definitely hear that critique, and I think it just speaks to how rental assistance itself is, especially emergency rental assistance, is really a band-aid solution in a housing market that is structurally unequal. With emergency rental assistance, that money was extremely necessary to keep people in their homes during an emergency period, but ultimately it did go to their landlords. And for people who were already cost burdened before COVID and remain cost burdened after and exhausted their full 18 months of rental assistance, it certainly kept a roof over their heads in a really important way, but it's not a structural solution. And I think that's ultimately why expanding the supply of deeply subsidized homes so that people don't need to be dependent on rental assistance and, the goodwill of their landlord to not raise their rent beyond a certain amount. Like, I think it speaks to the need for further structural investments. Thank you for that.
Yeah, my question is, in terms of advocacy, when we're thinking about just the deficit that the Portland metro area is in, and I remember reading on the website that there's about a 90,000 deficit of homes that are needed in terms of affordability in this area. And so, like, there's two big bonds that we just passed, the Portland housing bond and then the metro housing bond, that actually over the last couple of years that have produced around 6,500 units. And so in terms of this gap, are we like closing the gap, or is the need also growing at the same rate that we're building? So are we like making up the difference? And if so, like how can we continue to advocate for more funding and housing bonds?
Thank you. Yeah, there are probably other people in this room that might be able to speak more to the resources that Portland has passed specifically, but in terms of a larger context, it can be really hard to make the case for more funds when there has been a lot of funding already passed, and people will say, we spent a lot of money, why is homelessness increasing? But to give an example from Los Angeles, which I think grapples with similar issues, every single day, housing and homelessness programs in Los Angeles house 200 people and get them into housing from the streets, which is a huge accomplishment. And every day, 221 people become homeless in Los Angeles. So it's not a fixed stock of people that, it's fixed in time. And if you just build enough, you'll get everyone off the streets. If you have people flowing into homelessness because they get evicted, because their rents go up, or they face an unexpected expense, then you need to spend more to address homelessness, even if your programs are working and getting people off the street. So I hope that helps to answer the question, but it is definitely a challenge to advocate for more funds when so many have been passed. It's also, I think, an opportunity to highlight, look what we did with these dollars, look how many people we housed, but it's still not enough to meet the scale of the need. So I think there are success stories that come from those earlier resources that can then be used to advocate for further resources. Great. Any other questions while I'm down here? Yes.
Hello, folks. My name's Jamani. I don't necessarily have a question, but just more of a comment. While I think housing first, yes, but I think we also have to ask the question of what else. It's not only housing that are impacting folks. You have folks that are dealing with food insecurity, substance use, dealing with child CPS. I work as a doula in peer support and housing support. And one of the biggest crises that people are facing on top of housing is being able to access childcare to go to work, being able to access food, trying to get off the streets, trying to find, there's so many other things going on in people's lives that we also have to work on. But again, yes, housing first, but also what else? What are the comorbidities?
Thank you. Yeah, and something that we say all the time is housing first is not housing only. So like completely, no, that's great. Really appreciate that comment. Yeah, housing first is not housing only is something that we say all the time. And I think it's a misconception that housing first is housing only. But housing, none of those other things are possible without housing. And yet so much more is needed. So I could not agree more with your comment. All right, I'm just gonna check the time because I have an activity we want to do, but I also don't want to keep us overtime at all. Okay. Yeah, we don't really have time for the activity, unfortunately. But the activity was gonna be like do a little practice storytelling, sort of like simulate a meeting with a member of Congress. Trying to think if we have probably have like 5 minutes for it, which is not like really. Oh yes, question. Oh, a chat question, yes.
So their question is, how and where are statistics being gathered on older adults who are on fixed incomes and are being pushed out of housing as rents rise?
Yeah, thank you for that. I believe that I might be misremembering this, but I believe the National Alliance to End Homelessness actually just put out some data on homelessness among older Americans. I can look into that and see if I'm remembering that correctly. something that we do within our gap report. We break down the demographics of who extremely low income renters are, and consistently see that a huge share of them are seniors, and people on fixed incomes cannot afford housing. So all those out of reach statistics will actually show the breakdown between what someone on a fixed income can afford and what the housing wage is. So definitely that's a piece of our work, but we don't have that kind of comprehensive data.
I'm just going to quickly share my story. I'm Tommy Reen Hetman. I live in a home forward building. I sit on the board of commissioners as resident commissioner, which means I have the very good fortune to represent all of the residents that they house in their buildings and help to house throughout Portland. I was born homeless. I was born homeless with the RH factor, meaning the blood in my body was poison to my body. And these are two themes that have stayed with me, recurring homelessness and health issues. And I'm not going to cry. I'm not going to cry. Last time I was homeless, the entire time I was going through shelter after shelter here in Portland, I would go to medical clinics and beg for a biopsy because no doubt in my mind I had a cancer. Repeatedly was told, and it made it into my medical records, oh, you don't have cancer, you're just an overweight perimenopausal woman who's homeless and depressed. Oh yeah, we homeless people are not even taken seriously at all. It was not until 7 years after I got my housing with Home Forward that I finally went to a naturopath, female naturopath. First thing she asked, what's the most glaring thing that you want me to address? Get me a damn biopsy. By the time I had my surgery that cured me with just surgery alone, I had been living with my cancer for close to 20 years. And so it's not just that we need housing, we need supportive services. We need society to take homeless people seriously. So I'm getting down off my soapbox.
Thank you so much. I'm just so glad that you're here to tell that story and are such a leader in advocacy, bringing that story to us. So I just really appreciate that. All right, I'll take one more question. Then I have about 5 minutes of ways to stay involved, announcements, opportunities, all that.
Hi. I guess the thing I wanted to share isn't really like a question, but it's more like when you were talking like what's like a victory that I've seen like in our community. So it's not an Oregon specific community. So I grew up in Michigan, and a lot of folks in here probably didn't like see this news that came out yesterday, but in Dearborn, Michigan, which is the largest community of Arabic people outside of the Middle East, they just got designation by the city of Dearborn as being like the largest home of Arab American people in the United States, right? And it's not because there's just been like a sudden influx of Arab Americans move into Dearborn, but it's because in the census, they are like, so like this might come as a surprise to people in here, but like as it comes to the census, Hispanic and Latinx folks and Arab Americans are supposed to write down white when it comes to race, right? And so like when we look at like race and ethnicity information, the numbers don't tell the entire story for like a Latino community or an Arab community or even a white community, right? Because there are income gaps for Latino and like Latinx and Hispanic communities, right? Versus like a non-Latin white person, or the same goes for Arab Americans as well too. But so like with Dearborn designating, giving Arab Americans a classification, that is a victory in itself, right? Of getting more clarity on income situations for different populations of people. And so like that's something I would like to see happen here. I don't know what the steps would be to oh, go ahead.
So in the state of Oregon, we're actually gathering real D data, which stands for race, ethnicity. Oh, I can't remember the A, and I believe D is disability. And that is data that is used by Measure 110 in order to accurately represent different races, ethnicities, and cultures, even representing white folks in a more broad and in a more ethnic term. So folks can identify as Northern Slavic. You're not only talking about if somebody's Latinx, but are they from a Caribbean community? We're really gathering data on who is in the state of Oregon and using that to accurately represent who's here and how we allocate that funding. And that's mainly used in different health systems too. So like when you go to the doctor, they're probably gathering that information as well.
Thank you both. And yeah, I think a lot of advocacy is on having data collection because we don't know what we don't know, and we don't know what the needs are until we have a way of gleaning them. So congratulations on that victory of recognition in Dearborn. And I know there is a lot of advocacy for the next census to kind of include those categories, so we can, hopefully that will be a model that will inform those federal efforts. I know we're super short on time, so I'm just gonna kind of really quickly walk through some ways to stay involved with us. And if you're interested in the activity, it's in those handouts. Highly recommend, if you're doing any advocacy, give it some practice, talk through a conversation, and you can use the model in that handout in the future. But so to stay involved with us, I highly recommend joining our regular webinars and working group calls. We have updates on federal policy, disaster housing recovery, and a bi-weekly tenant talk live session geared towards resident leaders. You can learn more at that URL, nlihc.org/working-group calls. I also recommend signing up for our newsletter, which comes out on Mondays. It has the latest on federal policy, regulations, research. There's a link there to sign up, or if you want me to sign you up, just come up to me after and I'll get your email added. And last but not least, we are a membership organization. We have over 1,000 dues paying organizational and individual members. So if you're interested in being officially counted as part of our network and strengthening our movement, you can join at nlihc.org/membership, or there's also membership forms in those packets. There's a lot of really great membership benefits. If you want to come to DC for our annual policy forum in March, which includes a Hill Day that has a really great advocacy opportunity, you get a discount on those tickets. You can get discounts on our print publications and also invitations to quarterly virtual policy advisory committee meetings where we solicit feedback on our policy agenda. Oh, yes. Yeah, we solicit feedback on our policy agenda in those meetings. New members also get a complimentary copy of this giant encyclopedia of housing programs called the Advocates Guide. So if you end up joining as a member, you can just email me and I'll mail you one. If you know you're going to join as a member and you want one today, please come take one, because I brought these here from DC and I really don't want to bring them back. Like, really don't want to. So if you are a member already and don't have one, or you're planning to join, I have 3 here. I will gladly give those out, and then I can mail some out to anyone who doesn't get one today. So I think that brings me to the end. Again, it was so great to connect with all of you. Thank you for all of the great questions and comments and insights. I will be around for the rest of the day. I'll be at the gala tonight, so please come find me, and you can reach out to me anytime at ccooperman@nlihc.org. I also am always happy to do presentations like this one for virtual audiences, so hope to stay in touch. Thank you all.